November 4th, 1944. 11:18 p.m. Lenox Avenue, Harlem, New York. The kingdom of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was measured in blocks, but its true currency was shadow and whisper. From the back table of the Red Rooster, a fortress of plush leather and cigar smoke, he held court. The air, thick with the scent of bourbon and ambition, swirled around him like a royal mantle. Outside, the autumn chill bit at the city, but inside, under the warm, jaundiced glow of the low-hanging lamps, Bumpy was the source of all heat. His empire, numbers, protection, narcotics, was a bulwark against a world that had drawn a line around Harlem and dared its inhabitants to cross. Bumpy hadn't just crossed the line. He'd erased it and drawn his own. His face, a mask of calm authority sculpted by years of quiet calculation, betrayed nothing. His eyes, however, missed nothing. The way a numbers runner nervously polished a glass, the hushed conversation between two policy bankers in the corner, the precise moment a newcomer entered his domain. His lieutenant, Junie Bird, stood sentinel near the door, a man built of brick and loyalty. He was Bumpy's shadow, his confessor, his fist. He saw the king in his element, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of organized chaos. "Everything quiet, Junie?" Bumpy's voice was a low rumble, the sound of gravel settling deep underground. It never needed to be raised. "Quiet as a church mouse, Bump," Junie replied, his gaze sweeping the room. "The collections are in from the 7th Avenue spots. Dutch Schultz is still a ghost, and the Italians are minding their side of the street. It's your world. The rest of them are just paying rent." Bumpy allowed himself a small, tight smile. It was true. He'd fought wars for these blocks, bled for them, and now they were his. A sanctuary built on sin, perhaps, but a sanctuary nonetheless. It was a place where a black man could be a king. But the crown was heavy, and the kingdom's walls, he was beginning to understand, were made of glass. The boy who brought the letter was no older than 12, his eyes wide with the nervous energy of a messenger carrying a lit stick of dynamite. He approached the table with a reverence usually reserved for the church altar. He handed the thin, crinkled envelope to Junie, who inspected it before passing it to Bumpy. "From the train station, boss. Said it was urgent." Came up on the silver meteor. Bumpy took the letter. The postmark was from a place he tried not to think about, Clarendon County, South Carolina. A lifetime away. A world away. The handwriting belonged to his cousin, Elise. He'd sent her money every month for the last 10 years, a tithe paid to the memory of his own southern roots, a place of heat, dust, and a fear so pervasive it had its own taste. He slit the envelope open with his thumbnail. The scent of magnolias and dread seemed to rise from the paper. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. November 28th, 1954. Attica Correctional Facility. I seen Bumpy handle a lot of things. I seen him face down 4 of Luciano's torpedoes with nothing but a sharp look. I seen him calm a riot on 125th Street with a few quiet words. The man was made of steel and ice. But that night when he read that letter, I saw the steel melt. It was just for a second. His hand, the one holding the paper, it started to tremble. Just a little tremor, like the ground shaking before the whole world comes apart. He read it once, then he read it again. The look on his face, it wasn't anger, not at first. It was something deeper. It was the look of a man who built a castle on a cliff, only to turn around and see the whole damn ocean rising up to swallow it. He folded the letter, real slow, real precise, like he was trying to fold away the words themselves. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 10 years, the king of Harlem looked lost. He just said my name. Junie, that's all. And in that one word, I heard it all. The kingdom was under attack, but the enemy wasn't in New York. It was somewhere far away, somewhere a Harlem king's power meant less than nothing. November 4th, 1944. 11:58 p.m. Bumpy Johnson's private office, Harlem, New York. The office was his sanctuary, paneled in dark mahogany, the shelves lined with books he'd actually read, Dumas, Machiavelli, W. E. B. Du Bois. He sat behind his massive desk, the letter smoothed out before him. The words were a venom seeping into the polished wood. "Dearest Ellsworth, I pray this letter finds you in good health. I would not trouble you, but I have nowhere else to turn. The men in the white robes, they are coming. They have been active for months, emboldened by the war, they say. They burned the church down in Somerton last week. Now, they have set their sights here. They are planning a grand rally, a purification, they call it. November 8th. At the old Miller's Field, just outside of town. They delivered a notice to every colored family. A warning. They named names, Ellsworth. They named my Samuel. My boy is only 9. He did nothing. But Mr. Abernathy, he tried to register our men to vote, and I helped him hand out the pamphlets. They said Samuel would be an example. A lesson for the whole county. They said they would show us what happens to those who forget their place. The sheriff, he just laughs. He's one of them. We are alone here. There is nowhere to run. Please, Ellsworth. You are the only powerful man I know. Is there anything you can do? Your loving cousin, Elise. Bumpy closed his eyes. The mahogany-paneled safety of his office dissolved. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was a boy again in the suffocating South Carolina heat, remembering the stories whispered by his elders, the tales of strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. The abstract horror of his youth had become a concrete, imminent threat to his own blood. His power, his money, his army of men. What good were they here? He could buy politicians in Albany, judges in Manhattan, but he couldn't stop a mob of armed, hate-filled ghosts in a place where his name meant nothing and his skin color meant everything. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the controlled, predictable pulse of his street. Lenox Avenue. His street. He owned it, but he didn't own the world. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, washed over him. He gripped the windowsill, his knuckles turning white. The glass fogged with his breath. For a moment, the unshakable Bumpy Johnson felt the terrifying vertigo of true powerlessness. He felt a tremor in his hands, the same one Junie had seen. He was a king whose kingdom had just been revealed to be a gilded cage. November 5th, 1944, 9:12 a.m. The Harlem Eagle newspaper office. A cold dread had settled in Bumpy's gut. He sent one of his runners to get the Southern papers, anything from the Carolinas. The boy returned with a stack, and Bumpy spread them across his desk, the cheap newsprint smelling of ink and far-off trouble. He found it on the third page of a small, local paper from Columbia. A small article, barely a column inch. Klan activity rises. Local civic groups report a rise in Ku Klux Klan activity in Clarendon County. A recent barn burning is being investigated, though Sheriff Miller reports no credible leads. A planned demonstration is rumored for later this month, which officials state will be monitored to ensure public safety. It was a lie. A quiet, sanitized, bureaucratic lie that covered a world of terror. But then, a sidebar caught his eye. A separate, smaller report from a neighboring county. Family perishes in house fire. The Washington family of 3 was killed in a house fire late Friday night. Officials suspect faulty wiring. The family was known to be active in local voter registration efforts. The Washingtons. Elise had mentioned them in a letter last month. Friends of hers. The coincidence was a punch to the stomach. Faulty wiring. He crumpled the paper in his fist. Was he too late? Was the letter a plea sent out just before the fire? The false alarm. The stab of misinformation was more potent than any truth. The possibility that Elise and Samuel were already gone, their fate reduced to a 2-sentence lie in a backwater paper, sent a surge of ice-cold adrenaline through his veins. The world tilted. The calculated calm that had defined his entire life shattered into a million pieces. He swept the rest of the papers off his desk with a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. The sound echoed in the quiet office. Junie, standing in the doorway, flinched. He had never heard such a sound from Bumpy. It wasn't the anger of a gangster. It was the howl of a man watching his family burn. Bumpy leaned over his desk, his head in his hands, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the man who had stared down the entire New York underworld, was shaking. He wasn't just shaking. He was crying. Silent, hot tears of fury and fear that traced paths down his stoic face. He was praying, not to a god he believed in, but to any force in the universe that might have been listening. Not them. Please, not them. Junie stepped quietly into the room and closed the door. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a loyal witness to the complete and total unraveling of his king. In that moment, The mission was no longer about business or territory. It was a holy war. November 5, 1944. 1 p.m. A warehouse on the Hudson River piers. The rage had cooled, forged into something harder, sharper, purpose. The vulnerability was packed away, locked in a box deep inside him. Bumpy stood before a gathering of his most trusted men. Not just numbers runners and enforcers. These were the veterans of his war with Dutch Schultz. Men who had proven their loyalty in blood and fire. There were 110 of them, packed into the cold, cavernous space. They were the muscle and bone of his organization. Listen up. Bumpy's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. It was the voice he used before battle. We're taking a trip. Down south. South Carolina. A murmur went through the crowd. This was unheard of. Their operations, their power, was in Harlem. The South was another country, a place most of them had escaped. This ain't about business, Bumpy continued, his eyes scanning the faces of his men, weighing them. This ain't about money. This is about family. My family. Which makes it your family. Some people down there, some cowards who like to dress up in bedsheets, have forgotten the rules. They've forgotten that you don't touch a man's blood. We're going down there to remind them. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the cold air. We leave in 3 hours. We're taking 6 cars and 2 trucks. Junie has the travel plans and the hardware. You'll be given 2 days' rations and your piece. We travel nonstop. No trouble on the road. We are ghosts until we get there. Once we're there, we are thunder and lightning. Any man who doesn't want to make this ride, the door is right there. No hard feelings. This is not an order. This is a request. He stood in silence. Not a single man moved. Not one. They were bound to him by more than money. He had given them respect, a place in a world that offered them none. He was their king, and his family's blood was their own. November 5, 1944. 4 p.m. The journey south begins. The convoy moved out as the sun began to dip below the Palisades, a procession of dark sedans and heavy-duty trucks melting into the afternoon traffic heading for the Holland Tunnel. Bumpy rode in the lead car, a black 1941 Cadillac Fleetwood, with Junie at the wheel. The car was an arsenal on wheels, with modified compartments holding Thompson submachine guns, shotguns, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. The city lights faded behind them, and the landscape transformed into the dark, rolling hills of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The mood in the car was grim, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the crackle of the radio playing big band tunes that felt like they were coming from another planet. Bumpy stared out the window, the passing headlights illuminating his face in stark, fleeting flashes. He was a general leading his army into foreign territory. November 6, 1944. 7:30 a.m. Outside Richmond, Virginia. They pulled over at a prearranged spot, a desolate truck stop chosen for its isolation. The men emerged from the vehicles, stretching their stiff limbs. They were a jarring sight in the quiet morning mist. 110 sharp-dressed Harlem men, their faces hard, and their city clothes a stark contrast to the rural landscape. They ate cold rations from paper bags, their movements efficient, their voices low. Bumpy moved among them, a word here, a nod there. He was assessing their readiness, their resolve. He could see the tension in their shoulders, but he also saw the unshakable loyalty in their eyes. He had asked them to follow him into the mouth of hell, and not one had hesitated. November 6, 1944. 8:15 p.m. North Carolina-South Carolina border. The air changed. Junie felt it first. It grew heavier, thicker, charged with a static electricity of history and hate. The trees seemed to crowd closer to the road, their branches like grasping fingers. The signs for towns had names that sounded like whispers from a painful past. They were now behind enemy lines. Every car that passed, every face seen in a gas station window, was a potential threat. They stopped for gas, a silent, coordinated operation. 10 men would form a protective perimeter while the others worked the pumps, their hands never far from the guns hidden in their coats. The white station attendant looked at the procession of black cars and the grim-faced men with a mixture of fear and confusion, but he took their money without a word. He knew trouble when he saw it, and this was a form of trouble he had never seen before. November 7, 1944. 3 a.m. A secluded farmstead, Clarendon County, South Carolina. An old friend of Bumpy's father, a farmer named Silas, had offered them refuge. His farm was miles from any main road, a hidden pocket of sovereign land in a hostile world. The convoy rolled onto the dirt path with their headlights off, guided only by a single lantern Silas held on his porch. The men disembarked, melting into the shadows of the barns and outbuildings. Bumpy met Silas on the porch. The old man was weathered as the barn would behind him, his eyes holding the deep, sorrowful wisdom of a man who had seen too much. "Ellsworth," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You brought the whole damn city with you." "I brought what was necessary, Silas," Bumpy said. "Elise and the boy, they're safe. For now. I brought them here 2 nights ago, after the cross was burned in their yard. The rally is tomorrow night. The whole county's buzzing with it. They say the Grand Dragon from Georgia is coming. They're expecting thousands." Relief, potent and overwhelming, washed over Bumpy. The news report had been wrong. They were alive. The fire was for another family, another tragedy, but not his. The false alarm had burned him out. But now, with the truth, the cold purpose returned, sharper than ever. "Thousands?" Junie asked, his voice tight. Silas nodded grimly. "They're coming from all over the state. They feel righteous. They feel powerful. They plan on making an example of somebody after the speeches. To celebrate." Bumpy looked out into the oppressive darkness. The air was still, but it felt like the held breath before a scream. He could feel the hate radiating from the surrounding towns, a palpable, physical force. His 110 men seemed like a pitifully small number against an army of thousands fueled by generations of poison. But they were not here to fight an army. They were here to kill a ghost. November 8, 1944, 6 p.m., Miller's Field, outskirts of Manning, South Carolina. The field was a vast, open scar on the landscape, surrounded by a dense forest of longleaf pine. In the center, a monstrous cross, at least 30 feet high and wrapped in kerosene-soaked burlap, stood waiting. Cars and trucks were already arriving, parking in haphazard rows. White-robed figures moved through the twilight, their pointed hoods stark against the deepening purple sky. The scene was surreal, a nightmare brought to life. The low murmur of the growing crowd, the nervous laughter, the shouts of greeting, it all combined into a sickening symphony of anticipation. Bumpy and his men were positioned in the tree line, a silent, dark wave waiting to crash. They had approached from the north, through miles of dense, unforgiving swamp and forest, using the terrain as cover. They were invisible, specters in the pines. Bumpy watched through a pair of military-grade binoculars, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw families, men, women, even children, gathering for the spectacle. They brought picnic baskets and blankets, their faces alight with a festive, perverse excitement. This was their entertainment. This was their community. The sheer, banal domesticity of the hatred was more shocking than any overt violence. He scanned the crowd, looking for the leaders, the ones on the makeshift stage near the cross. He saw the local sheriff, not in uniform, but in the robes of a Klansman, his face visible and smiling. The system wasn't just complicit, it was the guest of honor. The near-death discovery was not of one person, but of the soul of a nation. It was the realization that this wasn't a fringe group of lunatics. This was a pillar of the community, a celebration of a deeply ingrained sickness. The squalor wasn't physical, it was moral, a spiritual wasteland more terrifying than any Harlem slum. The imminent death was not just aimed at his cousin or her son, but at the very idea of hope for black people in this land. November 8, 1944, 7:45 p.m., Miller's Field. The Grand Dragon took the stage. His voice, amplified by a crackling loudspeaker, was a venomous serpent slithering through the night air. He spoke of purity, of heritage, of the sacred duty to protect their way of life from the encroachment of the lesser races. The crowd roared its approval. The sound was primal, a single beast with 1,000 throats. Bumpy lowered his binoculars. "It's time," he said to Junie. There was no grand charge, no hail of gunfire. That was not the plan. Bumpy understood that a firefight would only get them all killed and be spun as a massacre perpetrated by Northern thugs. This had to be surgical, psychological. He was not here to start a war, but to perform an exorcism. The plan had three parts. First, the lights. 10 of Bumpy's men, positioned at the edge of the field, simultaneously threw the switches on a dozen high-powered construction floodlights they had brought with them, wired to portable generators. The night exploded into brilliant, artificial day. The field was bathed in an unforgiving white light, stripping the Klansmen of their shadowy anonymity. The crowd recoiled, shielding their eyes, their monstrous ceremony suddenly looking pathetic and cheap under the glare. Second, the perimeter. At the same moment the lights hit, 100 of Bumpy's men stepped out of the tree line. They didn't run. They walked. They formed a perfect, silent circle around the entire field. They were dressed in their finest Harlem suits, their fedoras pulled low. Each man carried a Thompson submachine gun, holding it not in a posture of aggression, but at parade rest, a symbol of disciplined, overwhelming force. They were a wall of silent, dark-suited judgment. They said nothing. They did nothing. They just stood there, watching. The message was clear: you are surrounded. Your safe little world is no longer safe. Third, the king. Bumpy Johnson, flanked by Junie and 8 of his largest men, began to walk from the edge of the forest toward the stage. They moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, their polished city shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil. The sea of white robes parted before them, the people stumbling back, their hateful chants dying in their throats, replaced by gasps and fearful whispers. The sight was impossible, an apparition. A black man, dressed like a king, walking into the heart of their sacred ground as if he owned it. Bumpy stopped at the foot of the stage. He looked up at the Grand Dragon, whose hate-filled sermon had stuttered to a halt. The man was sputtering, his face, visible through the eyeholes of his hood, a mask of disbelief and rage. The sheriff, standing beside him, reached for the pistol on his hip. Before he could draw it, Junie raised his own shotgun, the thwump-thwump of him racking a shell echoing across the silent field. It was the only sound. The sheriff froze. Bumpy never took his eyes off the Grand Dragon. He didn't shout. When he spoke, his voice was calm, conversational, yet it carried across the field with more power than the loudspeaker. "You seem to be having a party," Bumpy said, a faint, chilling smile on his lips. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Bumpy Johnson. I'm from New York City. I came down here because I heard you were looking for a boy named Samuel. A 9-year-old boy." He let the name hang in the air. "Well, you found him," Bumpy said, his voice dropping lower, becoming more personal, more menacing. "You see, Samuel, he's my blood. He's my family. And in my world, there are rules. The most important rule is you don't touch my family." He took a step closer to the stage. The men in robes around him shrank away. "So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen now. You're going to end this little costume party. You're all going to get in your cars, and you're going to go home. You are going to forget the name Samuel. You are going to forget the name of his mother, Elise. You are going to leave every colored family in this county in peace. Because if I ever hear that anyone has bothered them again, I won't come back with 100 men." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent, stunned crowd, the floodlights glinting in his dark eyes. "I'll come back with 500. And we won't just stand here. We will burn this whole county to the ground, and we will salt the earth so nothing ever grows here again. Do you understand me?" He was looking at the Grand Dragon, but he was speaking to the soul of the mob. He was confronting the systemic evil not with bullets, but with a promise. A promise of annihilation delivered with the calm certainty of a businessman discussing a contract. The Grand Dragon was speechless. The illusion of his power, of their power, had been shattered. They were bullies who had just been confronted by a monster far more real and terrifying than the ones they pretended to be. Bumpy turned his back on the stage, a gesture of supreme contempt. "Let's go, Junie." He and his men walked back the way they came, a slow, deliberate procession. The wall of 100 men remained in place until Bumpy and his honor guard had disappeared back into the darkness of the pines. Then, as one, they lowered their weapons, turned, and melted back into the forest. The floodlights stayed on, leaving the thousands of Klansmen standing in the middle of a field, exposed, silent, and utterly defeated. The party was over. Witness testimony: Junie Bird. November 28, 1954. Attica Correctional Facility. The ride back, it was different. We were all quiet, but it was a good quiet. Like after a storm passes. Bumpy didn't say a word for 500 miles. He just stared out the window. I know what he was thinking, though. He was thinking about power. He had all the power in Harlem. But down there, he had to bring an army just to save one little boy. He won, yeah? We won. But he saw something in that field. He saw the face of the real enemy. It wasn't a gangster. It wasn't a rival crew. It was something old and deep and rotten in the ground of this country. And he knew, I think he knew right then, that no matter how high he built his castle in Harlem, the foundation was still sitting on that same rotten ground. It changed him. The king came back, but the crown sat a little different on his head after that. November 10th, 1944. 4 a.m. Bumpy Johnson's private office, Harlem, New York. Bumpy sat in the dark, a glass of bourbon untouched on his desk. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. The image of the rally was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The faces in the crowd, the chilling sound of their cheers, the sight of that burning cross waiting for a victim. He had faced them down, yes. He had won the battle. But Junie was right. He felt as if he had lost something fundamental. This was the beginning of his withdrawal. Not from a drug, but from an illusion. The illusion of control. He had built an empire on the premise that he could protect his own, that his power created a safe space. But the events in South Carolina had shown him that his safe space was a tiny island in a vast, hateful ocean. His power was a candle in a hurricane. For 3 days, he barely left the office. He spoke to no one but Junie. He ate little. He just sat, and he thought. He replayed the confrontation in his mind. He hadn't fired a shot. He had won with presence, with threat, with an understanding of the psychology of fear. He had turned their own tactics against them, but it felt like a hollow victory. He had merely held the monster at bay. He hadn't killed it. He thought about his own enterprise. The numbers, the drugs. He provided a service, an escape for people trapped in a world that offered them little else. But in doing so, was he not just another kind of system, preying on the vulnerable? He had always justified it as taking from a corrupt system and giving his people a measure of control, a chance to win. But after seeing that field in South Carolina, the moral lines had blurred. What was the real difference between a man who sold a dream of hitting the number and a man who sold a dream of racial purity? Both were illusions. Both preyed on desperation. On the third day, he finally spoke. Junie, he said, his voice hoarse. It's all a rigged game. The whole damn thing. Always has been. Bump, Junie said softly, pouring him a fresh glass of bourbon. No, Bumpy said, looking up, his eyes clear for the first time in days. I mean the game I'm in. The game they're in. It's all built on the same lie. That some people are worth more than others. We just use different excuses for it. This was his recovery. The painful, agonizing acceptance of a larger, more complicated truth. He couldn't save the world. He couldn't even save his people. He could only protect his small corner, his family. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his actions in South Carolina would have consequences. You do not embarrass men like that, powerful, connected men who hide behind robes, without a reckoning. The system would strike back, not with a mob in a field, but with gavels and prison bars. He finally picked up the bourbon and took a long, slow swallow. He was no longer just a kingpin. He was a man with a legacy to consider. He had saved his family. Now, he had to prepare for the cost. He made a call to a lawyer and began moving his assets, securing funds for Elise and Samuel, ensuring they would be cared for no matter what happened to him. The intervention was complete. The king was ready for the fall. August 17, 1951. Foley Square Courthouse, Manhattan. The reckoning came, not with a bang, but with a subpoena. It wasn't for conspiracy or murder or any of the things he was actually guilty of. It was for tax evasion. The federal government, unable to touch his real empire, used the same weapon they'd used on Capone. It was a clean, efficient, systemic response. The trial was a formality. Witnesses were produced. Ledgers, expertly doctored by his accountants, were expertly undoctored by theirs. He never mentioned South Carolina. Neither did they. But he could feel it in the courtroom, the invisible weight of what he had done. He had crossed a line far more sacred to the powers that be than any street corner in Harlem. He had shown them that their power was an illusion, and for that, he had to be caged. The judge sentenced him to 15 years. The recommendation was for the new, inescapable federal penitentiary. Alcatraz. June 23, 1952. Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Bay. The separation was absolute. Alcatraz was designed to break men, to strip them of their identity and their connections to the outside world. But Bumpy endured. He was no longer a king, just a number, AZ 1117. He worked in the laundry, read in the library, and kept to himself. His power now was internal, a quiet, unyielding resolve. His only connection to the life he'd left behind was the monthly letter he was allowed. It always came from Elise. She told him about the town, how the rally had shattered the Klan's hold, how a quiet confidence was growing in the black community. But mostly, she wrote about Samuel. With each letter came a photograph. Samuel at 10, holding up a fish he'd caught. Samuel at 12, standing proudly in his first suit for the church choir. Samuel at 15, tall and lanky, with his arm around his first girlfriend. Samuel at 18, in a cap and gown at his high school graduation, the first in their family to finish. Bumpy kept the photos in a small, worn box under his cot. In the cold, damp silence of his cell, he would look at them for hours. He was watching a life unfold from a distance of 3,000 miles and 15 years. A life he had saved. He traced the boy's face in the photographs, seeing a future that had almost been extinguished in a field of hate. These letters, these pictures, were not just updates. They were proof. Proof that his one act of righteous, unsanctioned war had meant something. It was the legacy he had chosen over his kingdom. A decade passed, a slow turning of pages in a book he could only read from a great distance. July 1st, 1963. Pier 41, San Francisco. After serving 12 years, Bumpy Johnson was released. He was older, grayer, the sharp edges of his face softened by time, but his eyes as hard and perceptive as ever. He walked down the gangplank from the ferry, a free man in a world that had changed dramatically since he'd been gone. Junie was there to meet him, older too, but his loyalty was a thing untouched by time. They didn't go back to New York right away. Bumpy had one stop to make first. They took a train east, then south, back into the country he had once invaded. July 5th, 1963. Manning, South Carolina. The town was different. The oppressive fear was gone, replaced by a cautious but tangible hope. The storefronts on the part of Main Street where black families did business were clean and busy. He saw black men and women walking with their heads held high. It wasn't a paradise, not by a long shot, but it was not the place he remembered. Elise's house was a small, neat home with a garden full of roses. She was waiting on the porch, her face lined with age and grace. She hugged him, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Thank you, Ellsworth. Thank you for my son." And then he appeared in the doorway. He was no longer the boy from the photographs. He was a young man, 28 years old, tall and strong, with a kind, intelligent face. He was a civil engineering student at Howard University, home for the summer. He looked at Bumpy with a quiet reverence, an understanding of a debt he could never repay. Bumpy's carefully constructed composure, the armor he had worn for more than a decade in the world's hardest prison, finally cracked. His eyes welled up. This was it. This was the payoff. Not the money, not the power, not the kingdom. This young man, standing tall and free, his future a bright, open road. Samuel stepped forward and extended his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you, sir." Bumpy took his hand, his grip firm. He looked into the young man's eyes and saw not a stranger, but the living embodiment of the most important thing he had ever done. "Don't call me sir, son," Bumpy said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. A small, genuine smile finally broke across his face. "Everybody in the family just calls me Pop."